It is now my great privilege to introduce to everybody Val Richey, who is the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Persons. The OSCE, as you all know, is 57 participating states who work together on various things, and Val really leads their human trafficking efforts in that regard. He is, in addition to being a world leader at this moment in anti-trafficking initiatives, somebody who's really devoted his entire life, his entire career in one aspect or another to the fight against human trafficking. He was, for the lawyers among us, he was a prosecutor for 13 years in the state of Washington, where he really worked on these cases. He knows them from the inside. He knows the individual stories and the human beings who are impacted here. So far more than a policy person, he is the real deal. And we are incredibly, incredibly privileged to have him participating here today. Val?
Well, thanks so much, Laura. It's great to see you. I wish I could be with you all in person, of course, but thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to Dave and to Rotary for inviting me today, and also, and maybe more importantly, for your continued leadership on this topic. It's just been phenomenal listening to the panels today already. Great to see Ambassador Richmond. But also I listened to much of the panel on the medical field. Really great to hear this expertise as well. And I know you have a great lineup for the rest of the day. So let me jump to it. 20 years ago, a group of diplomats and lawyers and experts gathered in a city called Palermo in Italy and produced the first international definition of human trafficking. This was a watershed moment in our collective, and I say our, everybody on this call, our collective effort to sort of understand and confront and ultimately end exploitation. And I think a survivor who I met a few months ago summed this moment up pretty well. She had been trafficked in the 1990s and before the protocol. And she said, when it was done to me, what was done to me was not even a crime. And that really hit home for me, because what it helped us understand is, first of all, that thankfully the world progresses, that human rights progress, that our efforts to combat exploitation progress, and that the protocol finally put a name and a label on the many forms of exploitation that occur across the globe. This was really crucial. By diplomacy standards, and I work now in the diplomatic arena, by diplomacy standards, the Palermo Protocol has been a giant success. I think you heard John Richmond talk a little bit about this earlier. It's been adopted by more countries than almost any other modern convention. And the result is that it proved to be a turning point, but because it put the issue firmly into national legislation in their criminal codes and on the international political agenda, which was fantastic. And yet, and this is where the story turns a little bit grim, 2 decades later, not one country has defeated trafficking. In my job, I get to work with 57 countries from North America, Europe, and Central Asia and beyond. And I support them, and my team supports them with technical assistance, capacity building, research, policy development, and really trying to make sure that trafficking stays high on the political agenda. And I get to travel to lots of countries. In the last year and a half, I went to 30 countries in our area. And the more that I work with them, the more that I travel and I see the reality on the ground, and the more that I engage with them at the political level, the more I'm persuaded we are not actually winning this battle against trafficking. In fact, I'd say despite better laws, greater awareness, more investment, better police work, we aren't really even on the cusp of winning. Human trafficking is as widespread and as embedded in our economies and societies as it's ever been. But, and this is a crucial but, that does not mean I don't think it's winnable. It just means that we aren't winning yet. It absolutely is winnable. And today, what I wanted to talk a little bit about is what I think we can do to win, and to ask for your help in how we do that. Now, at its core, trafficking is the exploitation of people for financial gain. It feeds off economic, gender, racial inequalities, and it's a key symptom of the frailty in our societies. In this sense, it's not merely a crime, and this is really crucial, I think. It's not merely a crime, but it's really a social problem reflective of the core imbalances in our society. Tens of millions of victims around the world are trafficked yearly, as you heard from Dave at the beginning, including in our neighborhoods and our own communities. There are more slaves, as Dave said today, than there ever have been in history. And human trafficking, unfortunately, has infected virtually every corner of modern society. It's very likely in the technology we're using right now to talk with each other, in the clothes that many of us are wearing, in the food that we might eat later today. This is not some crime committed far away, but rather has found its way into many aspects of our modern life. And we can actually see it if we choose to look for it. Now, where does it come from? What causes it? Yes, there are inequalities and vulnerabilities fueling this crime, but poverty is not what causes trafficking. Poverty and desperation make it easier for traffickers to do what they do. But trafficking is the response. It's reactive. It's reactive to the core cause, the demand that is incentivizing trafficking. Demand for cheap goods and labor, demand for paid sexual services, even demand for life-saving organs, all of which can be extracted from victims of exploitation. The fundamental problem is there's been, I believe, a comprehensive failure to really confront the scale of the issue, the degree to which it's enmeshed in our society, in the same way that slavery in the United States and other countries in the past was enmeshed in our society. Slavery wasn't defeated because we sent police officers to kick down doors and arrest slave owners. It was defeated when we decided as a society that there was no place for it anymore. In the US, it even took a war. Now, today, as then, we will need to honestly reckon with our societal and our cultural complicity that allows trafficking to flourish if we want to defeat it. A law enforcement only response will never work. And trust me, as a former prosecutor, this is a very cold bucket of water. We have to acknowledge that this crime will only be defeated if we go outside and supplement law enforcement with a societal response. The scale of the problem is such that there just aren't enough police officers, prosecutors, judges to get rid of this crime. It's like emptying a river with a bucket. We'll get some of the water out, I assure you. But when we're done, the river is still there, undisturbed. We need to work upstream at the core intersections with our society on the conditions that allow the river to flow. Now here, unfortunately, but I think necessarily is where the conversation gets a little bit more uncomfortable, because we have to start talking about us, and we have to start talking about what does work, and we have to start talking about action. So first, I'm going to outline a few things that I think we can do. First, we must stop paying for trafficking. Goods and services produced by human trafficking or forced labor victims find their way into our economy, our stores, our homes, our businesses, and they generate tens of billions each year. The solution conceptually is quite simple. Governments, businesses, and individuals must stop buying such goods or services. Now, the implementation of that solution is, of course, more difficult, but the best way to do this is to require companies and governments to adopt policies and laws that prohibit such purchases, and to establish the necessary transparency, auditing, monitoring to ensure that such policies are enforced. If this sounds a little bit like what John Richmond was saying earlier, it is. It's because he and I have seen the same problems, the same challenges. We were both prosecutors, interestingly enough, and we both come out of this recognizing that there's a serious scale problem and that we need to address this as a society from a business perspective. I just listened in the medical panel to the discussion about whether there are, trafficking victims working in hospitals. And I think that the analysis was probably right, that probably not that much in the US. But what is happening is that the medical industry is buying a lot of stuff that was produced by trafficking victims. There's been numerous stories and reports about the medical gloves that are being produced by trafficking victims. So that raises the question is, are hospitals and the medical industry evaluating closely their procurement to ensure they're not paying for trafficking? That's a great spot to start. Think of the impact if Rotary ensured its own procurement was trafficking free and all Rotarians did the same with the companies that they work for. US Customs, as we heard earlier, is literally stopping at the border products that were made with forced labor. Are they catching everything? I doubt it. But it is certainly inspiring to watch them help shut down the market for these goods. What about in other countries where customs is not stopping this stuff? By looking into what we buy in our businesses and our associations and our governments, we dry up that river that I was talking about earlier. Number two, we need to eliminate trafficking profits from the financial services industry. And I'm delighted to see the financial panel coming up after this and the Noble Group initiative, fantastic initiative. Trafficking is estimated to generate $150 billion a year in profits, making it one of the most profitable crimes in the world. Now, FinCEN, which looks at this sector, has recently reported that despite massive illegal funds moving through the mainstream banking sector every day, barely 1 in 5 analysts could spot financial indicators of trafficking. That is exactly the opposite of what we need if we're going to win. As I said earlier, trafficking is a financially motivated crime, and we need to go after the money and make the crime risky for those who are committing it. We need to mobilize the financial sector to take steps to properly verify what goes through their systems. And good, effective instruments to detect funds originating from trafficking are there, but they need to be used. And I hope you all will discuss just how to go about that. I know you have some great speakers lined up who are going to help with that. Third, seriously, don't pay for trafficking. Does Rotary have a policy against sex buying? Buying sex fuels trafficking for sexual exploitation. It creates a demand, a market force that traffickers will meet with a supply. It's time to address our passive acceptance and willful ignorance of the huge market for sexual exploitation worldwide. How is it still largely tolerated to pay for sex when we know that trafficking for sexual exploitation generates nearly $100 billion a year? I'm not talking about prostitution, I'm talking about trafficking alone for sexual exploitation, meaning that men, let's be honest, men are paying over $100 billion a year to access trafficking victims sexually. Men in particular need to confront the reality of what paid sexual encounters are. Payment to set aside lack of consent. Failure to confront this undermines all of the efforts on gender equality in the areas of domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, the Me Too movement, by saying, well, we're going to try to help those women over there, but when it comes to poor women over here, it's free game. We cannot achieve an equal society if we have classes of women and who we're going to protect and who we aren't. This must end. 4, awareness raising. Victory against trafficking will come when all of society decides to end it. It will come when what we are saying here today goes beyond our virtual walls and reaches our neighbors, business partners, colleagues, and family. We need these messages to become mainstream, and we all have a role to play in that. Now, the 4 elements I just outlined, I think from experience and from the reports that we look at, from the countries we visit, from the impact that we have seen, are how we can get from talking about combating trafficking to talking about ending it. Trafficking is a part of our reality now, and only systemic change will be effective. Now, this has been and continues to be true for several years now, but today it's more urgent than ever. And I just heard one of the speakers on the medical panel address this topic, and I completely agree with her analysis. COVID has posed and continues to pose extraordinary challenges to the economic and social cohesion of all our communities. Vulnerable persons who before this crisis were already living in precarious circumstances are now at greater risk for being swept into exploitative situations. As traffickers always increase their recruitment in moments when people are in dire economic straits. This is not the time to turn away from combating trafficking, but a time to invest before a grave public health crisis turns into a human trafficking crisis. The scope is so vast that only by building a coalition across our society can we effectively confront the ugly reality that trafficking is and refuse it, reject it. Only by looking carefully at what we buy as a company, as a government, as an association, as individuals are we going to address the problem at its root, the demand. Only by adopting policies to prevent the purchase of sex are we going to shrink a market largely dominated by the exploitation of women and children. I recently read a study that concluded the single most decisive ingredient for tackling human trafficking in any organization, business, government, whatever, is leadership engagement. When leaders move, so will society. You are all leaders in your fields, and we count on you to promote within your organizations those procedures and systems that will help address trafficking at its core and at its roots. Change will not happen by itself. The Palermo Protocol demonstrates that. Laws don't implement themselves. It was a fantastic instrument that has set us up for success, but if we don't do anything with it, we won't achieve success. We must want it. And I know in my heart that we do want it, because society without trafficking is a truly free and more prosperous and safer society. It is in ours and everyone's interests. What will it take for each of you to become an anti-trafficking champion in your company and your organization? If you are here today, I'm guessing it's probably because you sense the potential impact you can have. So I invite you to take action, because the distance between winning and losing is our complacency. I recently stumbled on this great quote from a female survivor of human trafficking in the United States, which I think captures our need at this moment in time to tap into our humanity and start to look out for those who need our help. She says, "There is a person being exploited, someone who did not want to be used, bought, or sold, someone who just needed food, rent, someone who just didn't have anyone else to turn to or another choice. Until we see that person as our friend, neighbor, sister, daughter, it will never stop." It's up to us. Let's stop it. Thank you.
Great job. Laurie, why don't you?
Yeah, thank you, Val. Sorry, I was having a little bit of a delay on my system. Thank you, Val, for those beautiful, beautiful comments. We have a number of questions in the chat about online pornography and how online pornography factors into the demand side that you were talking about. Could you comment on that for us, please?
Sure, it's a great question. So a couple things to think about here. There is quite a bit of evidence that there's a close intersection between trafficking for sexual exploitation and pornography in a number of different ways. One of those ways is that increasingly traffickers are realizing that they can make money twice, which is by trafficking people for prostitution, but also trafficking them for forced pornography. And one of the problems is that pornographic or sites that host pornographic content often do a horrendous job at screening, regulating. There's very, very little age or consent verification. And the recent news stories around Pornhub are an excellent example of this, where numerous people were trafficked raped, and their content uploaded to Pornhub. So the first thing that we've seen in COVID times is a move from the street or in-person exploitation to online exploitation, where traffickers are realizing they can put the content online during lockdowns and still make money off of the content. The second way that I have seen an intersection between pornography and this problem was as a prosecutor, when I was prosecuting men who were trying to purchase sex from children, teenagers mostly. And I prosecuted over 200 of these men myself. And the most common characteristic that I saw in these men was, first of all, that they were white, second of all, that they were gainfully employed, and third, that they almost always had a significant pornography problem. And when I say problem, I mean like it was a discussed problem with the evaluator of their situation, that they were abusive in their use of pornography. And numerous interviews with these men cited this as a contributing factor to them ending up in a position where they were going online and attempting to engage in these acts. Can I say it's a cause? I cannot. I am not a psychologist. I can say it was certainly a correlation. And that is something that we've seen time and time again.
Thank you. A number of other questions here relate to supply chain. So as we talked about at the outset, we have many different people in many different sectors here. Can you offer any specifics on where companies might be able to turn to get help in figuring out if there might be any kind of trafficking in their supply chain? Many of these happen in places that are half a world away, and many Rotarians are involved in smaller companies that nonetheless have an interest in pursuing those issues. Do you have any specific recommendations of where they might want to start?
Most of our work right now is around trying to help governments figure out the best policies and laws they can put into place, and also address their own procurement problems, because governments are huge buyers. But we have also worked with the private sector. And one of the things that I've seen over the last few years is that the private sector has tended to be a lot more ahead of the game than governments on this issue, which I think is a really great feature. I think there's some great organizations, for example, Mekong Club, which was mentioned earlier, and numerous others who work with companies to help them evaluate their risks, figure out how to audit and monitor what kinds of policies they can put into place. What I do have is on the OSCE website, which is osce.org, you can go there and go to the Combating Trafficking page. And we have a supply chains page there in our office. And there we have a whole bunch of resources. What we're about to publish in about 3 or 4 days is a compendium online database of resources for governments, companies, et cetera, where they can go and see how different entities have addressed this. If you can't find what you're looking for, go on the website, there's an email address for my office, and we would be happy to help you out.
Terrific. I won't share with you the scores of thank yous that are showing up in the chat for your comments today, but let me add those from Dave and Matt and me as well. It's just really extraordinary to have you be here and have you leading the work that you're doing. You have 1 minute. I'm going to leave you the last word about your call out to the people who are listening here today.
Well, thanks very much, Laura. Let me say this. I think our best chance of success is not going to be for entities or organizations whose primary function is combating trafficking. I think our best chance will be when everybody else whose primary job is not combating trafficking gets engaged, just like Rotary is doing right now, just like all the groups who have been discussed today during the event. Right now, when they get involved, I think we're really going to tip the scales. And so for that, let me just thank you, Jones Day, Rotary, and all the other companies and organizations that are involved here, because this is really where we're going to move the needle. Thanks so much for your engagement.
Thank you, Val. It was a fantastic presentation, like Laura said. And Val and I met maybe 5 years ago at Shared Hope International when you talked about taking down an entire gang out west. And so you've always taken a holistic approach of addressing the issue. So thank you for your leadership for so many years.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Appreciate it.
Take care.